כל העולם מלא בצער ואלוהים הכל מראש נקבע. אני חושב שכבר הבנתי את זה קצת. ליד מרכז הספורט אמרה לי בוא נלך, אני קצת רעבה, רציתי רק לשיר איתה, לשיר איתה. רצינו רק לשיר, רצינו רק לשיר.
Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know, that was Israeli artist Shlomo Artzi, who we were listening to, singing Ratzinu Rak Lashir. All we wanted to do was sing, and I think as we talk about what we're going to be talking about today, you'll know that it was a very appropriate title song for our session today. So let's get into it. We have a lot to cover in this hour. Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Danny Schultz. And on behalf of the Westchester Jewish Council, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's event, a special event as part of our WJC Successful Monthly Israel Connection series, where for those of you who participated, you know that we typically cover culture, politics, life in general in Israel. And we felt it important to shift our attention a little bit to Ukraine, as you know. So I'll come back to that in a second. Just on WJC, we are an umbrella organization representing about 135 Jewish organizations, groups, schools, synagogues, and other institutions in Westchester, which is the 8th largest Jewish community in the United States, totaling over 150,000 citizens. I am proud to be a board member of WJC and chair of our Israel Affairs Committee, and frankly, I am truly honored to be hosting today's special talk, The War in Ukraine, a Military Analysis. Ukraine used to be a very, very ugly place for Jews in particular when real Nazis ruled the day. Today, it's a hell if you're merely human. And so we're going to focus on the war itself, how it began, how it may end, what led up to it, and what it may mean going forward. And we should all feel truly honored as we're joined today by my good friend, retired Major Mike Lyons, currently working with his alma mater, West Point, and a contributor at the Modern War Institute at West Point. He is frequently, very frequently, a guest military commentator on CNN, CBS, I-24, Al Jazeera, and other networks. If you've been up early enough any day over the last 2 weeks, you certainly would have seen him. And note, you can follow Mike on Twitter, and I encourage you to do that. But follow Mike on Twitter. There's his Twitter handle, and you won't be disappointed. Now, I've known Mike for a decade and a half, and it all started out, of course, as all great things do, with hockey. So before we get into anything else, Mike, the most important takeaway question of the day, of course, is who's going to win the cup? That's
Hey,
the most
Danny.
important question.
So
And
thanks
there's
for
only one
having.
answer to that question.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thanks. It's a privilege to be on with you. And like I said, I am very grateful for our friendship. I gotta go with the Florida Panthers. I'm a lifelong Ranger fan, but I think I didn't get a chance to watch 3 overtimes last night. I had to get up early this morning for a hit, but the Florida Panthers have got what it takes. And so if you really are looking at it, you have to like what they got.
Well, they lost last night.
Yeah, they sure did. Like the Rangers, like our Rangers.
Like our Rangers. All right, so let me tell you all a little bit about Major Mike. Mike graduated from the U.S. Military Academy in 1983 with a degree in general engineering. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in field artillery and was first stationed at Fort Knox, assigned to an armored brigade of the 18th Airborne Corps. Major Lyons was eventually selected to attend the Armored Career Course and was assigned to the 1st Armored Division responsible for NATO operational readiness and testing. Major Lyons rose to command A Battery, 3rd Battalion, 7th Field Artillery, and after 2 years as commander, Major Lyons deployed with 120 men to Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm with the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, where he was awarded a Bronze Star. Major Mike was later selected as aide-de-camp for the Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army 7th Corps and finished his last tour of active duty as executive officer to a U.S. Army 2-star general for Allied forces in Europe in the Netherlands. Mike spent 10 years on active duty, 10 years in the individual ready reserve, and holds an MBA from NYU in Stern in finance and accounting. He is, as I said, an established commentator with CNN, CBS, etc. Is now retired, a retired major in the U.S. Army Reserve, but remains very actively involved with many veteran support groups working to transition veterans from active duty back to civilian society. Now, I want to take a moment before we begin because for many of you, as you know, today is Yom HaZikaron. And I want to recognize that it is Yom HaZikaron in Israel, Memorial Day, Day of Remembrance, a day that is observed not only in Israel, but worldwide. And we commemorate today all those soldiers who have fallen and given their lives in defense of the state of Israel against her enemies and in guaranteeing the safety of its citizens, as well as all the victims of terror attacks in Israel and worldwide. Traditionally, the central focus of commemoration is a nationwide silence and siren that is observed in Israel when the country comes to a standstill. And I mean a complete standstill. We will join in that now, and then we will begin. I'm muted. So much for our high production value. Thank you, everybody. Remember, friends, please use your chat window on Zoom to let us know if you have a question. Mike and I will do our best to air as many as we can, but we have a lot of ground to cover. Let me state, if you're an avid watcher of the news, in these past few weeks, you've surely seen Mike on your TV or laptop, but usually for only 2 to 5 minutes. Today, we'll have a full 50 minutes. If we ever get started. So what I'd like to do is to introduce Mike a little further is let's play a clip from one of Mike's interviews with John Berman from CNN. Can we run that?
I know that you think the major fight really may materialize here in Donbass, where the Russians have concentrated most of their troops, and you see this as an artillery battle. Quoting Joseph Stalin, artillery is what? The god of war.
God of war, the king of the battle. Napoleon has always used it as the primary method. Now the race is on to get that artillery equipment coming from the West, not just U.S. supplies, not just the M777 howitzers, The French and the Germans are providing howitzers as well. The PZH 2000, self-propelled armored howitzers that will give crew protection, that allow mobility. That's going to be the key here as they fire on artillery units themselves of Russia. They've got to fight and then scoot. Move, shoot, communicate is the motto of the artillery. And so they've got to be able to survive that with mobility.
Can the Ukrainians, with the help of the United States and the West, can the Ukrainians match what the Russians already have in Donbass?
Well, they don't necessarily have to match. They just have to be good enough, and they have to just make sure that they can resupply themselves and make sure that they can defend what they can. What the kind of budget that now the West is providing the Ukraine military is going to allow them to eventually go on the offensive. That message, I think, is to Russia, not just to Ukraine. The $20 billion provides strategic weapons to Ukraine. That's going to allow them to eject the Ukraine from these areas in the Donbass. Likely, you could even argue that they could even take Crimea back. That is the level of military support they're getting. That kind of money is the military budgets of Canada, Israel. It is just a tremendous amount of money that they're going to be able to use to buy strategic weapons with.
What's the time frame?
All right, Mike. We're going to cover a lot of ground. The very beginning of the war, the current state of the war, where this may go, what does it mean for the region, the China-Taiwan relationship, the Middle East, and we'll touch on nuclear and chemical weapons, the effectiveness of financial sanctions, the air war that we don't hear all that much about, and of course, Mike's views on what happens next. So coming from a military background and having watched what transpired back in 2014, were you and your professional colleagues surprised at all by Putin's invasion now of Ukraine?
So Dan, thanks again for having me and for that great introduction. I'm a former artillery officer, which is why I speak highly of what's happening right now. We're 70 days in to the battle. And I wasn't surprised when they finally attacked. You and I talked that I think that there's a lot of similarities between this war and what happened in 1973 in Israel with the Yom Kippur War. I think that what you saw were Russian forces continuing to threaten Ukraine at their border. You saw it back in the 70s there as those Arab countries surrounded Israel, and they kept coming towards the border and threatening their security, forcing the country to deploy forces and shut down and hurt them economically until they finally end up deciding to attack. Well, the same thing happened here. Now, the war has been going on really since 2014 in the Donbass region, which is the southeastern portion of Ukraine, as Russian forces and separatist groups. And these are what are nominally called little green men, which are just more than mercenaries. I mean, the Roman legions have used mercenaries for, back then, and armies continue to use them today. What happened here now is Russia puts about anywhere from 160 to almost 190,000 troops, which we would call in the general location here, general vicinity. And not only that, then put them in Belarus to the north. And I frankly think a lot of it was ignored. I think Ukraine actually ignored most of it, and they could have done a lot more to improve defensive positions initially. But when this started on February 24th, we saw the Russians attack across very wide front, almost 7 different avenues of approach, if you count back then. And as a military analyst, I looked at it and said, given their mass, given their technology, given all they bring to the table, this could have been over in 3 days, 3 or 4 days. And I think Vladimir Putin thought that was the same way as well. But we see now 70 days in, that's just not the case. The Russian military has been utterly incompetent. They don't fire and maneuver. They do not synchronize all their fires. They know one thing: terror and terrorizing civilians. Again, similar to Arab countries that attack into Israel, without recourse and not hitting military targets.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Like many things, I mean, do we in the West view things with our own sensibilities and don't comprehend fully what other cultures are capable of or intent on? And we maybe erroneously, look at Eastern Europeans, of course, with maybe a very similar eye, but in fact, you've been at war. I mean, are you shocked by what seems to be the brutality of what is going on?
Well, again, it does get back to culture. I said this from the beginning as well, that this war will pivot on what the Russian soldier does when it's in face-to-face with Ukrainian civilians. And what we've seen them do, again, is fail miserably. They're committing tortures and rapes and robbing and looting, and they're doing things that the Stalin Russian army did back in the 1940s during the Second World War. I could tell you this: as a combat commander, I remember specifically in combat back and knowing that we were up against the Iraqi army. And I just remember fighting on Iraqi soil and them surrendering and them retreating and them they couldn't get out of there fast enough. They couldn't get their hands up fast enough. And I just remember saying to myself, a U.S. Army infantry platoon, a U.S. Army Girl Scout squad would fight and die to protect our country. Again, you see that same mentality within Israel as everyone is a soldier and everyone has to defend every day. You just don't see it. I think it does thread through the culture, which is why we expected Russia to do a lot better with this culturally, but I think it does unfortunately reflect poorly on it, and it's going to reflect poorly on it for years to come as they've become this international pariah right now.
Right. Has the West acted, in your opinion, in an optimal fashion here? What's happened with France and other NATO countries? It seemed like, frankly, like the term NATO is no longer heard that much on the news. There was an attempt early on to generate some diplomacy, and that seems to have waned, and now it's all about just delivering a military equipment, which may be the answer. But has the West acted, including the United States, in an optimal fashion? Is there something maybe you might have done differently with a military hat on in executing this defense of Ukraine?
Well, like anything else, we got here not because of really what happened over the past few months or even 6 months or so, or even 7 years, 8 years since 2014. We got here really since the fall of the Soviet Union and not recognizing security concerns from there. As NATO has put countries into it that frankly don't contribute. You saw the previous administration, Donald Trump, try to get countries like Germany, for example, to pay their fair share. It's not necessarily writing a check, it's investing in their military. And so NATO had been somewhat scattered and kind of lost its way. But this is now regalvanized, I think, a NATO mission for sure. I never thought we should have put Ukraine in NATO, and even you could argue some of the Baltic states as well, because we can't have the admission in NATO to be everybody but Russia. That's the kind of entanglement that started the First World War. And so, we have to look at it through Russia's eyes and think about security concerns they have when it comes to Europe and it comes to where missiles are and how things go. And that's what they were thinking about. But we got here, unfortunately, because of our failure to address this back first in 2014 when they overtook Crimea. They never really suffered any sanctions for that. Germany in particular continued to buy Russian gas, Russian oil. I can't see how you can have a country and outsource your energy to your enemy. I just don't understand that on any level. And neither did Donald Trump. And when he tried to make a big deal about it, unfortunately, he was lambasted over it, but he's proven to be correct. And again, military person would tell you that. But what the West has done, they started out kind of not sure. They weren't kind of how this was going to go. They probably thought it was going to go quick, but now they want to be on the side of winning. And so now we are pouring in equipment and pouring in supplies for the Ukraine military as they show, and the people are showing just incredible resolve. And so we've become the arsenal of democracy again, and it's back to the future. Frankly, we're back to the Cold War of the 1980s, as Russia has just demonstrated themselves to be not a reliable world partner.
So, all right. So let's pull up our first map, maybe, and let me just. So we can have a little bit of frame of reference and context, but the estimate on Ukrainian refugees originally, for those of you who've been following, was very early on was obviously under 1 million. You got to start somewhere, but it quickly eclipsed 1 million and is almost 6 million, maybe over 6 million refugees now. So about 15% of the population. It's estimated that there are another 8 million people who are displaced from their homes. Now, of those people, 90% are women and children. 90% is my understanding. Yet, from what I read, the estimate on how many Ukrainians have been killed is less than 5,000, which is no life. I mean, every life is sacred, and no life should be taken for granted. But let's talk about the current state of war and what's actually happening now on the ground. you know, give us your perspective here.
Right.
We all know about Kyiv and Mariupol and
Yeah.
Odessa and Lviv and
Mhm. Okay, so as a military guy, you always look at the map, you always look at geography, especially in the Army, because the Army's mission is to, close with, destroy, and take the enemy and have real estate. And so Russia attacks along this very wide front. The Battle of Kyiv has been lost. That's been lost for weeks now. They came in with battalion tactical groups from Belarus. So Belarus is now going to be another country well aligned with Russia that is going to feel the wrath of Western sanctions. They were never able to, what I'll call, eat the porcupine there, as they tried to take over a city with 4 or 5 million people, the size of Chicago almost. And they never brought, the right equipment. They never were able to do this. They actually thought the whole thing would fall. You look to the east now in Kharkiv and these places in the Donbass region, Luhansk, Donetsk. They were actually the areas you see here that are in somewhat of the pink. They were controlled by these Russian separatist groups. And what Vladimir Putin did after 2014 was move people into some of those towns that, while they still were part of the Ukraine government, they would vote for Russian things. And so I thought he was able to control the country without having to do something like this militarily, right? So war is an extension of foreign policy. You can't get things you want through diplomacy. You go to war and you do that. So I really thought that he was going to be satisfied with that. But as you listen to what he's been saying, it's always been more. Logistically, he needs what that calls that land bridge, where Mariupol is. That's really right in the middle of it, right there in the Sea of Azov as well, into Crimea. Now, the reason why the Russians need Crimea, needed it back then, and not just lease it from the Ukraine government, is because Crimea is the only warm water port for the Russian Navy. And so any of their ports in the north are all frozen at some point during the wintertime. So if they're going to project power anywhere into the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, and get into the Atlantic, as they try to, we chase their submarines down there as well. That's why they needed Crimea. So that was understandably why they took what they did back in 2014. But logistically, they couldn't get there from here, based on the distance, without going through the sea, which is why now this land bridge, and that's that pink area you see in the south through Mariupol, which is really the pivot point of that location. So the current combat is taking place on the east. In Izium is one of the, we're going to see a different map here. Izium is one of the other towns.
Let's bring up the Kharkiv zoom, if that.
So this is,
yeah.
We just heard this morning now, I just had a CNN hit this morning on this. So Izium is what's circled in green here. The Russians have now placed about 22 battalion tactical groups. That's about 15 to 20,000 soldiers and relative equipment in that area. They're reconstituted units right now. So from the Russians' perspective, given the fact that they've failed in phase one was supposed to be blitzkrieg, take over Kyiv, replace the government. That's completely failed. So now they're going to regroup and try to take over places where they think that they can get some level of success. And so and what they've done is they've placed battalion tactical groups in Izium and then Sheriver-Donetsk, which is a little bit to the right of that other green arrow there, that green circle, to the one to the right. And their goal now is, this is salient here, and you'll see in another map, maybe one more map here, Danny, the next map.
Yep.
Yeah, in this map here, you can see this kind of salient that goes to Slovansk and Sever-Donetsk, which is to the right of this in this map here. Well, the bottom line is Ukraine forces are inside the salient here, and they've been literally grinding up and chewing up and spitting out battalion tactical groups for the past 3 or 4 weeks in this location. And from a military perspective, what Russia's trying to do is break out. And what they need to do is bypass some of these smaller cities and get by them, encircle them later with troops. But they've not been able to do that because the Ukraine forces in this area have kept them bottled up within this salient which exists inside of that. Now, because of that, you've not seen any real advancement. You saw attacks last week on Karadomstak, which is a town where the railroad lines all meet. That's a key critical point where logistics is being resupplied to this region. But again, this is where you're going to see the fight take place over the next few weeks on the ground. The artillery battle now, we're getting reports too that artillery is getting to the front lines here. That's just amazing logistically when you think about it. as Russia will try to retake this land, kind of close this salient up, that white area, take most of the control of that. And if they can do that, then they'll control most of the Donbass region.
And you're saying that's a sort of a big enough goal to declare some form of victory for the Russians?
So everyone's looking at May 9th, which is
Right.
their day of victory in World War II. They forget that the rest of us World War I, World War II as well. And trying to predict what Vladimir Putin will do. What, you know, I think though, he recognizes that his army is potentially going to get destroyed the longer it stays in Ukraine. He deployed about 60% of his active forces to begin with. And we think that he's lost almost 25% of them already in just 2 months. I mean, that's unsustainable. You know, I can't, again, I just wake up, look at these analyst reports every day. I shake my head saying, how is it possible that he can sustain these kinds of losses? Well, he could double down on May 9th and go for full mobilization. And that would give him access to about 900,000 other troops and soldiers that exist within the Russian reserve. Russia has a conscript system. They call conscripts up, draftees up once a year. They have a 1-year contract. They train with their units and then they're released. And so they have some level of army training. Well, if he decides to mobilize and recall some of those people, you literally have cab drivers that are just over the border in the region there in Russia that could literally be sitting in a tank 2 weeks later without any kind of military training, because their military reserves really aren't that good as well. So that's what we have to see. Does he mobilize the country on May 9th, or does he try to declare some kind of victory in Mariupol or some other place and look to take his army off the field a little bit to keep it from getting destroyed? Because that's really what's happening.
So let's drill down a little bit more. You're an artillery guy, and we'll come back to things that don't get that don't roll on the ground, so to speak. But let's talk about weaponry and how this war is being fought, because again, to me as a layman, it feels like a bit of an anachronism. That's the right word. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, weaponry and what's been effective for the Russians and what frankly has been effective for the Ukrainians, and then we'll kind of go from there.
So Russia brought to the battlefield about 10 times the amount of tanks, armored vehicles, helicopters, planes that the Ukrainian military had. Okay. And so as I look at the battlefield and see what's going on there, 30 years ago when we were in Desert Storm, we would sit on on ridge lines and literally shoot the tops and shoot at Russian tanks and shoot the tops off. And I just couldn't believe how easy it was. We had what was called standoff. We could fire at them at a greater distance than they could hit us. And I took pictures.
Sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, these are pictures I took when I was there of tanks with the tops blown off of them. And it was a design flaw back then that the ammunition was not segregated in these tanks in areas where that they could have any kind of crew survivability. The one reason why Americans, and I'd say the Israelis, I trained with the Israeli army in their armor corps. And the reason why is because we're smart about crew survivability. We recognize that you have to have soldiers that are confident in their equipment and they can survive if they get a hit. Well, you look at these tanks that are showing up on the battlefield today, it's the same thing. The design of Russian equipment is just so poor that a small javelin, for example. So let's even take that another step. So while they have 10 times the amount of tanks out there, the United States has poured in about 17,000 javelins. So javelin is a smart laser guided system. It's fire and forget that tracks in on the exhaust signature of an armored vehicle. So there's no escaping it. They can't outrun it. It's rocket propelled. You just got to get close enough to it, which in this case is about a couple of miles away. But the Russian tanks have not been able to escape them. Ukraine military is literally blowing the tops off of advanced Russian tanks, T-72s, T-80s, T-90s. This is the most advanced Russian systems that they have brought to the battlefield. Well, those $2.5 to $3 million tanks are getting destroyed by $100,000 rockets called the Javelins. And on top of that, now we've put in 17,000. So now we've got 10 times the amount of anti-tank weapons in theater that Russia has tanks. So they're being used for more than just the tanks and the armored vehicles. So this is the kind of thing that the West has provided, and I'll call it American soft power. Aside from this, it's the intelligence that we're giving down to the battlefield. We're giving the Ukraine military locations as to where units are. The fact that they've got 7 or 8 general officers already killed, again, just incredible. And I think a lot of it has to do with because we're telling them where they are. We're showing them where the command and control centers are.
Yeah, so let's touch on that for a
Yep.
second. What can you tell us? I find this fascinating. What can you tell us about the Russian command and control systems and how it's failed Russian sort of the higher ups, and in fact helping the Ukrainians locate senior generals, and also that sort of pulls in the whole subject of internet and Starlink as well. But go ahead, why don't you address that?
So Russia started this attack with electronic countermeasure units, entire units that they were going to move forward in the battle that were designed to blind and silence Ukraine command and control. As it turns out, it ended up blinding and silencing Russian units as well. And so they had to turn it off. And then on top of that, the Russian radios and Russian electronic equipment didn't work. So then they started using literally cell phones. The cell phone towers were still working. So then you lay over the level of US intelligence that's being provided to the Ukraine military. So now we're geolocating individuals with their cell phones on the Russian side that the Russians don't have the same capacity to do. They're in a foreign country. They can't do this. And you never saw these cyber attacks. Russia is really a peer when it comes to the US, when it comes to cyber capability, but they've not been able to take out and take out systems within Ukraine to shut the lights off or shut the power plants off. They've done dumb things like attack the nuclear plant in Chernobyl and start to dig foxholes there. I mean, again, the level of just sheer stupidity from Russian military commanders on how they're fighting this war just shows itself all the time. So again, and Starlink, the fact that the internet still works. So we also talked about that in the pictures that are coming back, that it's all being recorded. There's no escaping Russia from the war crimes that they're committing there as it's being taken every day. So Russia not only is lost on the ground tactically, but they've lost it in the internet and they've lost it in electronic countermeasures that we really thought that they were going to have an advantage in.
Incredible. Can you spend a few minutes now that we're sort of talking about, so to speak, feet on the street? What can you tell us about the Russian soldier versus the Ukrainian soldier? Give us sort of a profile. And I've heard you talk about size of again my layman hat on, but the BTGs and the numbers of troops that there are and what kind of age they are and what level of exhaustion they are facing.
So Russia started this with about, I'd say, 120,000 ground troops, 190,000 total within the region supporting them. That's all the logistics and other things, but let's say 120,000 warriors, and those are soldiers with weapons that are crossing the border, fighting as infantry, artillery, in tanks and APCs. I would say Ukraine had probably anywhere from 50 to 60,000 of those kind of soldiers that were dedicated on the front. Now they had some in reserve and civilians. You saw a lot of mercenaries came. Normally, to attack on the offense and have success, you have to attack in a ratio of 3 to 1. So right away they did not bring enough troops to the battlefield in order to ensure success. If you just look at history. The Russian soldier, though, is unfortunately poorly trained. They're year-long conscripts. And in this case, this was at the end of their conscription contract. In fact, Putin had to extend the contracts of the current conscripts. So they're not professional soldiers. They also don't have a professional non-commissioned officer corps. That's the backbone of our military. The non-commissioned officers run things. They make sure equipment is running, provide the day-to-day leadership. And there's none of those in their reserve units, which again, so as people come back into the Russian military, they're going to fall in on these units that are being destroyed. So the Russian soldier gets put in a tank, gets one job, is not taught initiative. Russian chemical masks, for example, don't have a way for Russian soldiers to speak. That just goes to show you that Russian soldiers are not designed to be heard. They're just designed to basically shut up, do what you're told, sit in this vehicle, and fire away. And again, you see examples of them abandoning tanks, the Ukraine farmers taking tanks away from them, and this is why they've lost so many tanks. And it's unfortunate. Now take the Ukraine soldier. The Ukraine military has been training with NATO forces for the past 7 years. So they're doing all the things that NATO and in particular US forces do. That's number one. There's this expression in the cavalry. It's called the horse, the saddle, the man. And that is, you got to take care of the thing that gets you there, the transportation mode, which is that equipment. The second thing is the saddle, which is the equipment that goes around it, you know, what you can. And then the last thing you take care of is yourself. And that's what you kind of focus on when you get in battle. Well, you're seeing that Ukraine equipment has been stood up to the task. Ukraine leadership, Ukraine's guile, and the fact that they've gone on a counteroffensive in Kharkiv, for example, and they've pushed Russian troops out now well beyond artillery range. So they've got what we'll call good NATO training on how to fight as a combined arms and how to fight to win. We thought Russia's masses, we thought all those troops would just matter. But as Russia has thrown its young men, unfortunately, into the cauldron here, into the fodder, they've been just chewed up and spit out by Ukraine forces. I think this diagram shows you, and let me try to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
A battalion tactical group has anywhere from 800 to 1,200 soldiers. And again, these are battalion tactical groups that are being reorganized and reformed. That's come from Kyiv and these other places where they've had losses. So they're probably they could be at 50% strength. But this is just one example of how well the Ukraine military is doing. You look at 1 week from April 25th from May 2nd, just look at the tank number alone. 884 tanks had been up to at that point in time. And by May 2nd, a week later, virtually over 200 plus tanks destroyed by the Ukraine military. Now, 200 plus tanks, there's 10 tanks within a battalion tactical groups. That's destroying virtually 20 battalion tactical groups. Same with APCs. There's about 25 within each battalion tactical group. We're destroying 250, 300 armored personnel carriers. So again, all of the American soft power with the javelins, the stingers, the creativity that the Ukraine military displays is chewing up and spitting out these Russian battalion tactical groups as they're formed. And they're not learned. That's the thing. The second thing the Russians must be doing from a military perspective is learning. And they're just not learning. They're not adjusting. They still attack literally on the ground without the cover of air, without the cover of artillery. And it shows literally every day in these reports.
All right. So the picture that you paint, though, makes me begin to think that things can get worse than better. And by that, I mean, it's a very dynamic, fluid situation. This could get more dangerous. And we've heard Putin, saber rattle with respect to, other kinds of weapons we've never seen before. Mm-hmm. We're all on sort of our own high alert regarding chemical and nuclear weapons. Talk maybe a little bit about what has happened before in Syria, what you surmise might be going through the minds of some Russian generals or Putin. What happens here if there's more of a desire, basically, so I'll ask my question, mm-hmm. Third way, to dramatically alter the status of what you just described, because Russia's on a stalemate or worse footing.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, they're going to continue to lead by missiles and rockets and artillery. We saw that yesterday. They fired about 25 cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea. It just shows to show you thousands of miles, 1,000 miles away, because they can't fly over Ukraine because they don't own the airspace. Again, unthinkable from a U.S. forces perspective. We don't move U.S. troops in areas unless we own the airspace. That's number one. But I'm of the camp that says they're not going to use tactical nukes or chemicals, because they need to keep this ground. Chemicals would ruin if they tried to, fire a chemical weapon into something and they'd have to follow it up with troops. That just doesn't work. And let's say the worst possible case is, and they did decide to fire some low-level nuke, and they have something called the father of all bombs. It's basically the upper level of conventional forces, and it could kill a lot of people. The bottom line is the boundary. This is still a regional conflict. We have to think of it as that. And what I mean by that is the boundary of Ukraine, the border of Ukraine is the red line. And as long as the activity stays inside of there, if NATO decides to get involved inside that border, then we've escalated, then we're going to have responsibility for escalating. So for example, we have to get them weapon systems across that border, let's say air defense platforms that could help destroy some of those cruise missiles. Well, they got to be fired from inside Ukraine, because if they're fired from Poland or Romania, or Moldova or some other place, then it's going to look like an act of war, and it's going to allow him to escalate. And again, we talk tough about nuclear tactical nukes. I listen to congressmen talk about, respond in kind. Okay, tell me what the target is. What's the target? And no one can answer that question. No one can answer how we would do that. So it is a very hard pill to swallow for right now. But here's also the harsh reality. Mm-hmm. There's very few countries in the world, but Russia is one of them, that can fire a rocket from a submarine in the Atlantic and hit any city in the eastern coast, anyone. And they could do it in a time of flight that there would be virtually no response. There would be no capability for us to even know it's coming and us to react to it. 9/11 happened based on our lack of creativity, not thinking what our enemies could do. At the end of the day, Russia has that capability. And I'm hope we're shoring up our air defense systems and the like, because in some ways we didn't focus on them because anti-missile systems are in effect destabilizing, right? We had those treaties with Russia in the 70s and 80s because of MAD, mutually assured destruction, right? Long as if Ronald Reagan tips the balance, creates Star Wars, creates this potential way to go on the offense to destroy the Soviet threat of having a nuclear attack, well, then it bankrupts their country, because they lose their minds. They realize that they won't be able to use that as a threat anymore. Well, so we've got, those are so anti-stabilizing. So we got to get back to a stabilizing platform that'll allow us to defend. And again, we just have to recognize that that's there, which is why it's regional conflict. It all stays in the boundary of Ukraine.
And is there a concern at all, you'd think, amongst Russian generals that, I guess, you made the point that if you use chemical weapons or nuclear weapons, I mean, is there sort of, blowback back across the border? I know seasons and weather make a difference here, but, does he potentially risk, killing and injuring many supporters in that if he goes ahead and does that?
Yeah, sure. If he puts a low-level attack in Kyiv, for example, it's horrible to think about it, but it renders the city, it would, you couldn't live there for years, 50, 100 years, depending on how much nuclear fallout takes place. The fallout could also come back onto Russia. I mean, it crosses an incredible line that we just don't know what he would do or what he can do. But we also can monitor whether or not those weapon systems, because they have a signature, they have a heat signature. So we've cleared our desks. I know this in the intel industry right now. And we can monitor whether those systems have crossed the border. So it's one thing to have a nuke, it's another thing to deliver a nuke, right? And so how would it be delivered? It's likely if he delivers a nuke, it's going to come from either the air, from an airplane, from a cruise missile. The artillery nukes, when I was in the military, I was responsible as an artillery battery commander for special weapons, for nuclear weapons. And so we had a 155 nuclear round that we were trained on and we were firing. Well, Russia has those, but we would also be able to tell whether they're in country or not. And we're not seeing any reports that those things are in country right now. So any of the nukes that were coming would have to come, from inside of Russia, someplace, from a cruise missile or from that side.
All right, so let's shift now to a little bit of talk about air war and use of drones. We don't seem to be, and you touched on this a little bit before, we don't seem to be seeing or hearing much about the Russian Air Force. I know the Ukrainians were asking us, I may be getting this slightly wrong, but asking us, for refurbished MiGs. But there's no air war going on at all, it seems,
Right.
which again seems like anachronistic and sort of basic. I don't
Yeah.
get it.
So a couple of things. First of all, Russia can't establish air superiority. Why? Because they can't kill of the 10,000 stingers that we've placed in that country. Okay. The fact that we've got individual man pads, which are, man shoulder fired weapon systems that can take out Russian planes, similar to what we saw in Afghanistan going back 40 years ago. It's amazing how crazy that is. But they can't establish air superiority. And on top of that, their Air Force is not designed to be a strategic asset. And our Air Force is only strategic assets, deep bombing missions, our Air Force is a strategic platform, strategic weapon systems, just like our Navy, right? Well, not in Russia. Russia is all about close air. Well, they can't fire close air because they can't, if it flies, it dies, because anything that gets out there close, it gets shot out of the sky. So they've not been able to take out the SA-300s, the air defense systems that the Ukraine military has had for the past few years. Now we're going to get them some other systems, Patriot systems, to start getting the kind of the Iron Dome system, what was developed in Israel, for example, that'll help with some of those rocket and cruise missile attacks. I think that'll be important. So that's really why there's been no air war. It's like watching World War II from my perspective. It's literally the same kind of battles that are taking place, with really dumbed down technology on the Russian side. And go back to us, COTS. We're using, the Ukraine military is using commercial off-the-shelf COTS, that's what that stands for, drones. I mean, drones for firing, gathering information, using these things and modifying them for for battle. So the creativity that they're doing on that side. There's one thing that I think that we're also going to give them, that we're going to see this eventually, and that's this swarm technology. It originally thought out by Israel, that says if you fire like 10,000 drones, put 10,000 drones in the air, a small drone, small things that can be weaponized, can be not weaponized, you can confuse the airspace and confuse the tactical operations and really kind of make a mess of things. So I think you're going to possibly see that in the coming months as that technology gets to the battlefield.
Okay, that was a great segue. You just used the word months. Let's take a pause. What has Russia achieved? It seems, I think we have a better sense of maybe what Ukraine has achieved or avoided. But in your estimation, how's this going for Russia? How might this end? Is there some kind of a low-level stalemate? When you say months, that sort of has crazy implications for what goes on.
Yeah, I think so. I think Ukraine's already won strategically throughout the world. I think once the fighting stops, the West is going to pour into Ukraine with money to rebuild it. I think Russia has become now an international pariah. However, they're still aligned with China. There's still 1.5 billion people there. India has been on the fence, but they've been focused more on China and Russia as well. So the world's going to get bipolar again very quick. It's going to get to be two poles of the East and West. India could have been a wild card. Perhaps we can work diplomatically over the next few years to try to bring them back into the West. But right now, because of our relationship with Pakistan, I just don't see them trusting the United States, unfortunately. But right now, it's going to be China and Russia is a vassal state of China. We could argued before, the previous administration tried to at least bring Russia into the fold. I think this event has proved that Russia was never going to be in the fold. Russia now is, I think, again, a vassal state of China. And it's, in fact, if the Chinese tell Russia to stop, that's one way that the world can stop. And we have to recognize that China has something to do with that. So I think it's going to go on for a long time. But in some ways, the Ukraine military wants to go back on the offensive, wants to win back some of those territories that they've lost. And that'll be just a tremendous accomplishment for them.
So in a minute, we'll open it up for some questions. And if we don't have any, I've got some more of my own. But let me ask you, it seems to me, not in the long run, but in the short run, it seems like Russia, and in fact, Putin's stock has maybe gone down with the Chinese, or do the Chinese, you think, maybe like the fact that because Putin may have done some foolish things, that they're more obedient toward China, and may in fact like to have a weakened Putin around rather than a Russia that internally somehow gets rid of Putin.
Right. So Russia has acted as an attack dog for China, and we can't get into a situation where we create the Third World War, and the United States suffers losses, God forbid, and Europe gets destroyed and suffers losses through Russian missile attacks into Paris and London and places like that. Can't conceive of that. Okay. And because what ends up happening is part of the reason why the United States has become this accidental superpower is a book about that. And the reason why we're a superpower is because we're 2-0 in world wars. And so the bottom line is, even if this next one, if it's ends in a tie or a stalemate, and we get kind of marked up and scarred up a bit, the Chinese are out of it. The Chinese don't have anything invested into this. The Chinese has not been, their government, nothing's been destroyed in China. So that's where we have to be very careful. We've got to recognize that, that we've got to watch the security of our country and make sure we're not attacked, do what we can to support democracy, do what we can. This is Europe's fight. There's no question the UK, if you want to read a good, if you want to read a great Twitter feed, it's the UK Defense Ministry. They get up every day. Their defense reports are phenomenal. I look at them every day. But Europe's all in. The fact that we woke the Germans up, that they're going to start providing weapons and equipment is just incredible, and they're going to stop buying Russian oil and gas, the French. And so that's where we've got to be concerned with China, Danny. I think that, they're not going to be off the hook on there. And frankly, if this doesn't stop soon, the rest of the West needs to look at China and say, look, you better get your attack dog on a leash and have him stop murdering people, because we're going to come after you now for it. This is a proxy war, and you're now on the other side of that proxy war.
All right. So we're going to open up some questions. We have one here from Robert Lesser. So we hear that Russian hard equipment is being destroyed and will take at least 2 years to replenish so far. And we are running out of soft power weapons and ammunition. What is happening to Russian soft items and ammunition? Aren't they running out and can't replenish quickly either?
Yeah, Robert, they've actually deployed about 60% of their forces to this fight already. They're in deep trouble when it comes to ammo and equipment. And on top of that, so Russia has literally in their inventory something like 25,000 tanks, if you kind of look them up. And that's because Russia still has tanks behind the Ural Mountains that they were used during the 50s and the 60s in Czechoslovakia. They don't retire anything, and they think they're going to bring that to the battlefield and overwhelm you with it, but all it's going to become is fodder for another target that will happen if they decide to do that. But they are too. They're having challenges, and if they want to have any success, they need the laser guided, and they need the GPS guided weapons. And I want to try to help them here, but they can't hit moving targets. They can't hit these targets of logistical supply chains that are coming through from the West. So that's really where they need the help in. They're running out of those as well. And again, like I said before, he's got a real risk of losing his army. General Austin last week said the quiet part out loud, right? He said, let's get this Russian army destroyed while it's there. Well, that's exactly what we were thinking in the Pentagon. We're saying, yeah, this is what we want to try to do, because he's in real danger of losing it. Similar to Saddam Hussein. If Saddam Hussein moved his army out of Kuwait, he wouldn't have lost it, and he ended up getting it destroyed in Desert Storm. So that's really
what do you think? Sorry, Mike, I apologize. No. What do you think the takeaway is with respect? And we've got a question here, and I was going to ask as well. But what's the takeaway with respect to China and Taiwan here? Is there a connection? You could, superficially say, oh, well, look at the similarities, but
yeah,
is it or isn't it? Maybe.
Well, I think two things. I think two things. First of all, China is trying to project power militarily. You look at their propaganda and their military, and they've put money into their Navy. But at the end of the day, they've never been in combat. Okay. Whether we like it or not, what the United States has become really good at is combat. Is no one wants to fight. You want to fight us conventionally, or NATO. You want to fight NATO conventionally. You are going to lose. And I think the implied message is there to Taiwan with the Chinese. that are like saying, good luck trying to do some kind of naval assault into Taiwan or trying to invade that country, because you're going to lose, because we're going to pour more stuff into that, and it's going to be such a fight. And when your units show up and have to actually defend, when you go to war, you don't fight for your country. Actually, what I mean by that is you fight for the person to the left and to the right of you, and your fight as a unit. You fight for what kind of what we're doing here. Well, all of a sudden, these Russian soldiers have figured out, what the hell am I doing in Ukraine? I was driving a cab a year ago. What the heck am I doing here? Fighting for Nazis? There's no Nazis here. What am I doing? Well, it's the same thing I think is going to happen to the Chinese military. They're going to get into Taiwan and like saying, what are we doing this for? These somewhat related to these people. I don't kind of get the objective of this. And I think that thread will go through that military, and they're going to, once again, they'll overestimate their capability and underestimate what'll happen in Taiwan.
Right. Now let's take it back to Ukraine for a second. So Russia has begun to attack logistics, right? And as you even mentioned, interdicting sort of weapons supplies and arrival of fresh weapons to the front line. What's the risk there?
Well, they're attacking right now fixed energy plants and places that they should have been, frankly, they should have attacked 2 months ago. So I'm surprised at that. They still won't be able to hit these moving targets. So they're going to go after rail lines and the like. You saw the Russian generals say that, we're going to attack these NATO convoys. They're not NATO convoys. They're going to be convoys that are coming in from the Ukraine side. I think that's, again, a lot of talk. All they can do is attack those fixed areas with the cruise missiles. And so that's why I think cruise missile defense is going to be really important. I just saw a question there about sanctions. From my perspective, the sanctions are not enough. They're not working, and they're not working in the short term. They might work overall in the long term. Russia has absorbed what's happened so far. They really weren't serious from the very beginning, and in some ways, and that's because there's a side in the West that wants this to be over so we can all go back to normal again, right? But we're not going to ever go back to normal. This is not in our lifetimes. We've gone back to 1980. We've gone back to the Soviet Union. We've gone back to this enemy that we can't trust, that has this capability. And I think that's really why those sanctions were weak to begin with. They can be turned up if they want to be, but they just haven't been.
Right. Another great question here, actually, from Susan Summers. Are the Russians extracting their dead and wounded? My understanding is no. The other is, are there any realistic strategies for the safe release of the Ukrainians from Mariupol?
Well, first of all, I get choked up when I think about the fact that they leave their dead on the battlefield. That is 100% reflection of their culture. I can't fathom that on any level. I get tears in my eyes thinking about that. I can't imagine. U.S.
Doesn't it make it hard to fight? Doesn't it make it very hard? You talk about you fight, but ultimately you fight with the person to your left and to your right.
Exactly. I can't fathom that. That's 100% cultural, and doesn't reflect well. That's all I can say. The fact that their leaders allow them to do that. What's happened in Mariupol. So the other thing is, they've stocked that plant. They knew this was going to happen years ago. That plant's been stocked with ammo and food. And there's no question they're enduring a great hardship. But that battalion that there is they're going to fight to the last person, and they're going to wear down the Russians. That thing's going to get destroyed, and they're not going to be able to keep it. It's going to be one of those things that is going to purely Pyrrhic victory where Russia might end up taking it, but it's going to cost them so much. These analysts are talking about, well, they're going to take that and free up units to go north to fight in the Donbass. Those units that are in Mariupol right now are spent. They are done. They're combat ineffective. The fact that they can't take that as of right now, it's just, again, shows you their incompetence and their inability to fight. So it's not happening. They're not going to be able to reposition anybody from there anytime soon. But God bless them and save them, and hopefully, maybe they can escape through the sea. There's got to be a way to maybe let the soldiers escape, and let's hope he lets the civilians out. We'll see what happens.
So I'll use my host prerogative to ask maybe a final question here, and then see if you have any thoughts to wrap up. But any chance in seeing the Ukrainians put together some kind of a counter offensive here in some area? You mentioned the Yom Kippur War, and you made me sort of, you triggered my thinking about how ultimately at great cost early on, but ultimately the Israelis encircled the Egyptian Third Army.
Yep.
Yep. Is there something
So-
possible there?
It's very similar to what happened there. I think being attacked on two fronts. I had a chance to hear General Kahalani. He was the brigade commander in the Golan
Wow.
Heights there when I was at the armor school. Just the heights of courage, just the amount of courage, the technology advantage the Israelis had with their infrared sights. And what they did was just, again, amazing and similar to what Ukraine has done. They've attacked on two fronts. They're going to go on the counteroffensive. Let's hope we don't, tell them to stop, kind of like what we told Israel to do back then, unfortunately. I think the similarity is this trade-off for land for peace, but it's never going to happen. The Russians are going to continue to lob artillery and weapons in there. So I think that the Ukraine citizen and the Israeli citizen are kindred spirits right now with regard to the hardship that they're both enduring, having an enemy on their surrounded, frankly, and the kind of firepower that they had in terms of weapons and mass and personnel that they can brought to the table.
Well, Mike, we all appreciate it. I appreciate it. I hope to see you in the flesh at 34th Street between 6th and 8th Avenue sometime soon.
Yeah, that's great, Danny.
But thank you for bringing your wisdom and experience to our group, and in such an unfortunate subject, but one that we need to obviously talk about and learn about. So with that, everybody, thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for our next in the and Rick Kosis, see you at WSA, of course.
So, Rick. Thanks, Dan. Real quick, thank you very much. A privilege to talk to everybody here. Reach out to me if you have any questions, and let's pray for those in Ukraine and then for their safe survival.
Indeed. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.